The first plant to see the light of day is the one that gets ahead. This has huge implications in crop establishment and in using cover crops to suppress weeds. I'll be covering an article about this and many other things in Regenerative Ag News in this episode. Hi, my name is Scott Gillespie of Plants Dig Soil, the name of the podcast and the consulting company. We're an independent agronomy company. We do not sell products, we provide advice only. We focus on realistic regen ag, which has to be proven and profitable. We work in person or remote or a combination of the two. Our pricing is set to be affordable to anyone from a Q&A package to full farm planning. There's no long-term commitments. You can retain our services, do it yourself, or hire others. Of course, we always love to work with people over the long term. So this first article is from Top Crop Manager. It's about a U of G study that looks about signals from nearby weeds and how they affect plant crop growth. Now, this is something I've always wondered about with the plant green method, because when you're planting your crop into a green cover crop and then killing it later, I've always wondered how this affects the crop. Now, maybe if the cover crop is dying or has been sprayed and is giving out signals that it is actually dying, maybe it doesn't affect it, but it seems like it should. I know in the soybean studies with roller crimping, they've never been able to equal the yields of a full tillage system. So I do kind of wonder about this. Now, the article is definitely worth your read to get into the details of it, but the bottom line is that whoever hits the light first wins, and also gives signals to the crop plants or the other plants coming up that they need to be in defensive mode for the rest of their life. And I have talked about this before in previous podcasts, that whoever gets there first can have a huge impact. Now, in their research, they found that if the weeds come up at the first stage of crop growth, the yield loss can be 10 to 20%. But if the weeds come up even just 2 or 3 leaf stages later, then the crop loss is only about 3 to 5%. And this is related to the weed-free critical period, or the critical weed-free period in weed management, which is that if you can keep your crop weed-free in that initial stage, then you're good for almost the rest of the year. And then this is where, in my opinion, or in my thoughts on this, where interseeding a cover crop once your cash crop is established should provide almost no competition to that cash crop, because it's the one that's ahead. And then as long as you have a cover crop that can handle being shaded and then will take off in the fall, you're ahead. So anyways, check this article out. It's a very interesting read. Related to this is an article about how researchers believe that cereal rye, or it's also called fall rye, can suppress water hemp. This comes from a Wisconsin Weeds site, and in it they cover what they have observed and what they think is going on. Now, I've said this before in many other episodes, it's all about biomass, and so when the cereal rye covers the soil, there is almost no light interception, and this helps to prevent the water hemp from germinating. Now, even if they are germinating, if you're covering or shading the soil, that's going to hold them back or slow them down. There is the physical barrier, but they could push through. Now, the other key part of it that they do think is that the cereal rye does help to lower the soil temperature and make it less conducive for it to germinate. Now, of course, the problem with this is that you might also be inhibiting your cash crop growth. So this is where it's not a perfect system, but it is a way that you might be able to get the effects on the main water hemp, but then also get your cash crop growing. So again, it's interesting because it's based on scientific evidence, but it is also a little bit speculative in what they think is going on. And relating to this article is another one on cover cropping in the prairies, and it's in the Potatoes in Canada magazine. So in this study, in the prairies, they put in wheat with red clover frost seeded or spread onto it to grow. Then they followed a cash crop the next year with canola, and they had berseem clover and oats. Then they had potatoes, which were followed with a cover crop of fall rye, and then they did pea in the fourth year, and they had tillage radish and a mustard mixture. So when they got the results together, when they've summarized the 4 years of using these cover crops, they found that these rotations with and without cover crops were not significantly different from each other in terms of their crop yields, crop and or nitrogen efficiencies, and in-season nitrogen. Now they did use normal or recommended rates of nitrogen, so they kind of think that maybe that had a factor in not seeing a difference. So this is, it's unfortunate results for putting cover crops into the prairies, but it's not surprising in my opinion, because they did say that the biomass was not great on these cover crops. And so this is where I've seen a lot. Again, it does come to biomass. When you don't have much growth, then there's not a huge amount of impact on it. And unfortunately, when you put in economics into this, it's just not going to pay to put in all these cover crops and then end up with no real difference in your cropping system. Now, they have speculated, and I have speculated too, that this is something that we need to see happen through many cycles. It might take decades for the effects to start showing up where we do get a more efficient system. Or perhaps we need to just target the cover crops to where they are really going to make the biggest difference, like say, for example, after potatoes, rather than trying to get a cover crop after every single crop. So again, it's an interesting study, and I think it's well worth your read. Again, it shows that although cover crops have potential, there still needs to be a lot of work to figure out where they're going to fit into a prairie system. Now let's move on to something that could be a little controversial. There's a study on the efficiency of microbes to degrade crop residues, and this was in Top Crop Manager. It's a long read, and so I'd encourage you to check it out. But it's interesting how they checked out. This was not related to cover crops. This is just the cash crop residues. Different residues seem to stimulate different N2O, which is the very bad greenhouse gas. And they stimulated this in through all their different residues, and they have a lot of discussion on how much greenhouse gas emissions come out of these. Now, the bottom line is it was mostly related to water. So if you had a wet winter or a wet spring coming in, then you're going to have more of this greenhouse gas come out. Now, what is interesting is this relates to another big review that I came across, and I haven't had a chance to fully digest, but they found that cover crops can actually emit a lot of this N2O when a lot of people put it out as being the cover crops mitigate this effect. And I think this is because when you have whenever you have decomposing residues, you are going to have more potential of nitrogen loss if you don't have something else growing fairly quickly. Now, you've heard me talk about the fertilizer emissions reductions, and that's a huge, huge topic of the government of Canada wanting to reduce fertilizer emissions. But fertilizer emissions are just one small part of the emissions factor, and there are natural emissions of these potent greenhouse gases happening all the time, even in what would be considered natural areas or grasslands or forests. So I think there's a bigger picture here that we're going to have to start to investigate. Now, if you've heard me long enough, you'll know that I have a low opinion of multi-species mixes, or even sometimes mixes in cover crops, because to me, I think you put out the best species and let it do its job. Some interesting work that I did come across in Top Crop Manager was a pea cereal intercrop with forage production. Now, they only used just the two. They didn't use a cocktail blend. Now, you could argue, or some would argue, that they should have had that in this here. But I'm going to go into the article. It's amazing how much complication there is, even just having two species in a mix. Now, the bottom line is that they did find that the mixes did give a much more a better forage, better for the animals, a higher protein, which would make sense when the peas are in there. The interesting thing is that year to year there was variation in which one worked, or what kind of ratio worked, or what they got out of it. Now, they didn't cover this in here, but one of the things that I was wondering with this is that how much variation you're going to have field to field, year to year, or even within a field. You could be going through and having different areas making different quality of feed. So maybe this is why, although it has the potential, maybe this is why it hasn't taken off the way maybe people think it should, because when you're getting into the reality of a farm and having to have consistency in your feed, putting out a monocrop will ensure most of the time what you're going to get out of it. So for the final article today in this regenerative agriculture news update, this one will be controversial. The title of it is, "What's the best way to go from forest to crops?" So obviously the narrative in the media is that we need to be putting in more forest land or conserving forests or grasslands. But as the climate changes, there are more opportunities in northern Ontario, and I would expect also in the northern prairies. So the question is, how do you go from forest to crops in the best way? Now, of course, many would argue we shouldn't be cutting down forests and converting it into agricultural land, but the reality is it's going to happen, and there are people that are working on what the best way is rather than the common way. So again, it's a longer form article. There's lots of detail in it to go through. The main approach is whether you mulch the wood products in place, or whether you clear everything off the land and start from that. And they are looking at which way is going to hold on to more of your organic matter, more of your carbon in your soil, which one's going to give the best nutrient delivery, and make the farm profitable from the beginning of clearing. I would love to hear your feedback on this, because it's a very interesting topic, because even in the regenerative agriculture side of things, it is expected that by going to regenerative systems or getting away from the conventional way of doing things, we are going to need more land, because yields do go down even if profits go up. And so this could mean that we're going to need more land available to grow stuff on. So the question is, do we do more intensive on less land, or do we use more land that is done in a more regenerative or sustainable way? So I would love to hear your feedback on this. That was the highlights of what I saw in regenerative agriculture news this month, and I will put together another episode like this next month. But next week we'll be back into the podcast again. So I will see you again later.